In ancient Africa, there was a god whose name struck fear in the hearts of liars and comfort in the hearts of travelers. His name was Arusi-Ukpabi, the divine protector of hosts and their visitors. In every home that offered shelter and in every footstep of a guest, his unseen eyes watched. And when someone dared break the sacred bond of hospitality, his justice was swift, silent, and terrifying. This wasn't just religion, it was law. And in southeastern Nigeria, Arusi-Ukpabi wasn't just a god, he was the final judge. Picture a village where every stranger is greeted like royalty. Food is shared not out of kindness alone, but because failing to do so could anger the gods. It wasn't just about manners, it was about spiritual survival. But Arusi-Ukpabi's greatest power wasn't his presence, it was his shrine. Hidden within the caves of Arochukwu, his temple became a place where justice was rendered without trial. People accused of crimes were sent into the cave. Those who emerged were innocent. Those who didn't had been judged. The cave became known as the mouth of the god, a passage into divine truth. Locals claimed no guilty soul ever returned. And so the name Arusi-Ukpabi carried not just reverence, but dread. You might ask, how did such a powerful figure, once central to an entire region's way of life, disappear so completely from modern consciousness? Why is Arusi-Ukpabi barely mentioned in books, in documentaries, or even in African spiritual discussions? And what secrets still lie buried in the forests of Arochukwu, where the god's shrine once ruled life and death? In this video, we unlock the hidden legacy of Arusi-Ukpabi, a guardian of peace, a punisher of betrayal, and a divine presence whose memory deserves to rise once more. Get ready for a story of sacred rituals, divine justice, colonial silencing, and the mysterious god whose word was final. This isn't folklore, it's forgotten truth. To understand Arusi-Ukpabi, we must first step into the worldview of the Igbo people of southeastern Nigeria, a civilization built not just on kinship and tradition, but on a rich spiritual ecosystem where every natural element, every relationship, and every decision was overseen by unseen forces. Among these, Arusi-Ukpabi stood as a unique force, not a god of war or fertility, but one who safeguarded the sacred trust between human beings. He represented balance between justice and mercy, hospitality and duty, speech and silence. His name, often translated as God of the Long Juju, was more than just a title. Arusi means deity or spirit, and Ukpabi ties him specifically to a lineage and geography, a deity anchored in the ancient town of Arochukwu, the spiritual headquarters of the Aro Confederacy. Unlike many gods who demanded worship through ritual and sacrifice alone, Arusi-Ukpabi demanded something more difficult: truth. He wasn't worshipped simply through prayer, but through moral behavior, honesty, respect for guests, protection of the vulnerable. He was the spiritual enforcer of African hospitality, a concept so deeply embedded in society that it became law. To host someone in your home meant invoking the god's protection over them, and to harm them was to insult the divine. Yet Arusi-Ukpabi was also a god of consequences. He didn't preach forgiveness, he demanded accountability. In a society where written contracts were rare and colonial legal systems hadn't yet arrived, Arusi-Ukpabi's authority filled the void. Disputes were taken not to courtrooms, but to his shrine. It was said that before any important journey or oath, people would call on him as witness. His approval meant spiritual safety. His silence meant danger. The priests who served him, known as Okonko, were not just religious figures. They were powerful intermediaries who mediated conflicts, oversaw rituals, and sometimes even enforced political decisions. Their words, believed to be extensions of Arusi-Ukpabi's will, shaped destinies. Over time, this system of divine justice became central to the region's governance, blending spiritual belief with societal structure. Arusi-Ukpabi was more than a myth. He was a pillar of law, a moral compass in human form, and the silent observer of every pact and promise. At the core of Arusi-Ukpabi's power was his shrine, the legendary Oracle of Arochukwu. Tucked deep in the dense, sacred groves of southeastern Nigeria, this shrine wasn't just a temple, it was a portal between worlds, a physical and spiritual place where divine justice was delivered without appeal. To outsiders, it was simply a cave. But to the Igbo people and the wider Aro Confederacy, it was known as the Long Juju Shrine, feared and revered for its ability to speak the will of the gods. The entrance was narrow, surrounded by thick foliage, carved stone, and silence so heavy it seemed alive. Those summoned to enter were believed to be walking into the mouth of the god himself. And once inside, the cave became a labyrinth of tunnels, symbols, dark passageways, and chambers. Each section represented a spiritual trial. It was said that the gods would judge a person's spirit as they walked deeper. The guilty would collapse from unseen forces, never to return. The innocent would emerge, shaken, but alive. In reality, the priests of Arusi-Ukpabi played a powerful role in controlling the experience. They were both spiritual guides and political agents. Using sound design, hidden chambers, and dramatic rituals, they created an atmosphere so intense that most who entered believed they were truly being judged by the divine. And perhaps they were, because in a society built on deep belief, perception was power. But the shrine wasn't only for criminal justice. It was a hub of cultural power, a place where leaders sought guidance, oaths were made, alliances were sealed, and wars were sometimes prevented. Entire communities aligned their actions based on what the oracle declared. The British, upon encountering this system, were stunned. How could a society operate with such cohesion without European law? They couldn't comprehend that the Arochukwu Shrine was doing what their own courts could not, maintaining order through belief, not bureaucracy. But they also feared it. The shrine was a center of resistance. It gave the Aro people spiritual and political leverage, a unifying force that colonial powers couldn't control. And so, they labeled it pagan, barbaric, and dangerous. Eventually, they attacked. They invaded Arochukwu, burned parts of the shrine, and dismantled the oracle. Yet the legend of Arusi-Ukpabi didn't vanish. It went underground, into memory, into whispers, into the unspoken stories still told around fires in the villages. Because you can destroy stone, but belief hides in the soul. For centuries, Arusi-Ukpabi wasn't just worshipped, he was experienced. The stories told about him weren't abstract legends whispered in poetry. They were eyewitness accounts, passed down from fathers to sons, mothers to daughters, with one common thread: this god was real. One of the most famous tales tells of a man accused of poisoning his brother over a land dispute. No one had seen it happen, no proof, just suspicion. He pleaded his innocence, but the village elders demanded he walk into the cave of Arusi-Ukpabi. The man, defiant and calm, entered the shrine. He never returned. Days passed, then weeks. His name was removed from family records, as was customary for the guilty. His land was redistributed, and the message was clear. Arusi-Ukpabi had spoken. But not all stories end in judgment. There were moments of mercy too. Another legend tells of a woman accused of adultery, a crime that, in traditional society, carried social shame and spiritual danger. She too was forced into the shrine, but unlike many others, she returned. She walked out barefoot, with her head held high. Elders said she was untouched by the god, and her accuser was later found to have lied. The liar was banished. The woman, restored. These stories may sound like folklore, but in the communities that lived them, they were law, reality, and memory. Some even speak of supernatural visions inside the shrine. A glowing stone that pulsed like a heartbeat. Whispers in the darkness that echoed your secrets back to you. Cold air that clung to your skin, even in the heat of the dry season. And then there were the footprints, small, human-like marks said to appear inside the shrine at dawn, as if the god had walked among his priests during the night. Were these real phenomena? Tricks? Psychological effects? It hardly mattered. To the people, Arusi-Ukpabi was watching, always. His presence kept the peace. His legend kept people honest. He wasn't feared because he was violent, but because he was unavoidable. No one could lie to him, no one could bribe him, and no one could escape his gaze. Even now, those who claim to descend from his priests speak of dreams that are not dreams, of voices that call from the forest, of a shrine that no longer stands, but has never stopped whispering. The arrival of British colonial forces in southeastern Nigeria wasn't just a change of rulers. It was a direct assault on the spiritual fabric that had held communities together for generations. And at the center of that resistance stood the shrine of Arusi-Ukpabi. To the British, the Arochukwu Oracle was a threat. Not only did it unify surrounding communities through a common belief system, it also acted as a political tool. The priests could sway decisions, resolve disputes without colonial courts, and command loyalty that ran deeper than any colonial decree. That kind of influence? It couldn't be tolerated. In 1901, the British declared war on the Aro Confederacy in what became known as the Aro Expedition. Under the guise of stopping the slave trade and pagan practices, their true goal was to dismantle the social power of the Oracle. They believed that if they could silence Arusi-Ukpabi, they could finally bring the region under full control. They marched into Arochukwu with guns, cannons, and the arrogance of empire. They burned parts of the village, looted artifacts, and targeted the sacred shrine. The Oracle Cave, once seen as a holy place of judgment, was desecrated. Priests were killed or imprisoned. Sacred relics were stolen or destroyed. And with it, a spiritual order was shattered. But this wasn't just about religion. The destruction of Arusi-Ukpabi's shrine symbolized a deeper erasure. The colonial project didn't just seek to dominate land, it sought to overwrite belief, to label African gods as demons, African justice as savagery, and African wisdom as superstition. Christian missionaries followed the soldiers. They preached a new God, built churches on old sacred grounds, and told villagers their ancestors had been deceived by false idols. For many, the psychological war was even more devastating than the physical one. Yet even in the face of this devastation, the spirit of Arusi-Ukpabi did not fully vanish. He lingered, in memory, in silence, in the quiet fear that some truths still belonged to the earth and not the empire. The colonialists could burn the shrine, they could kill the priests, but they couldn't burn belief. Not entirely. In some corners of Igboland, his name was still whispered. In secret ceremonies, his presence was still invoked. And in every injustice the new courts failed to resolve, there were those who quietly wondered, what would Arusi-Ukpabi have done? In today's world of smartphones, courtrooms, and satellite churches, the name Arusi-Ukpabi might sound like an ancient whisper, something buried in dust and myth. But for many across southeastern Nigeria and beyond, he is far from forgotten. In fact, the god once feared for his absolute justice is beginning to re-emerge, not as a revival of temples, but as a symbol of cultural restoration. Across Africa, there's a growing movement to reclaim indigenous beliefs that were once demonized. Young people, scholars, and spiritual seekers are digging into the stories their grandparents were told not to repeat. And among those stories, the legend of Arusi-Ukpabi carries unique weight, not just as mythology, but as a framework for truth, accountability, and hospitality in a modern age. Traditional shrines in Igbo land are being quietly restored. Not all are functional, and not all claim spiritual power, but their presence alone challenges the idea that African spirituality was ever erased, only buried. In academic circles, Arusi-Ukpabi is now studied as an early legal system, a form of governance, and a case study in how deeply spirituality can shape society. And then there's the oral tradition, still alive in families who never stop telling the stories. Children still hear about the cave that could judge a man's soul. Elders still recall how guests were once treated with divine seriousness, and some descendants of the Okonkwo priests still keep symbols, rituals, and language alive, even in private. On social media, accounts dedicated to African spirituality have begun to mention him again, not as a ghost from the past, but as a relevant archetype, a god who stood for protection, hospitality, and justice when systems failed. Even the land remembers. In Arochukwu, locals say the cave where the oracle once judged still holds energy. Tourists come, some out of curiosity, others seeking something deeper, a connection, a feeling, a glimpse into a world where justice had a heartbeat. So while the shrine may be silent, the spirit of Arusi-Ukpabi continues. In every act of hospitality, in every demand for truth, in every challenge to corruption, his presence stirs quietly, reminding us that some gods never needed temples to leave their mark. Arusi-Ukpabi was never just a god. He was a witness to every promise kept, every guest protected, every truth spoken in the face of danger. In a time before paper laws and police, he was the divine thread that stitched justice into the very soul of society. He didn't need grand temples. His shrine was the heart of a people. His commandments were simple but sacred. Protect the guest, honor the truth, respect the divine order. Though his cave was burned and his name nearly erased, his essence still lingers. In the hunger for justice, in the sacredness of hospitality, in the quiet knowing that truth, no matter how buried, cannot die. Arusi-Ukpabi was the god who watched over all. And maybe, just maybe, he still does. If this story moved you, intrigued you, or opened your eyes to a forgotten piece of African heritage, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves powerful stories. Because history isn't dead, it just waits to be remembered.